On the quiet streets of Frederick, Colorado, a town where neighbors greeted each other and children played safely on sidewalks, life seemed ordinary. The Watts family appeared to embody the suburban dream. Shanann Watts, a bright, energetic 34-year-old woman, was a devoted mother to her two daughters, Bella and Celeste, and a loving wife to Chris Watts. Friends described her as caring, full of life, and endlessly patient. She frequently shared glimpses of her family life on social media, videos of her daughters singing, laughing, and playing, always with her husband by their side. To outsiders, the Watts home was warm, happy, and perfect. But behind the smiles and curated photos, the marriage between Shanann and Chris was quietly unraveling. Chris Watts, a 33-year-old man working in the oil industry, presented a calm, stoic exterior. Yet beneath that surface, tension and deception had begun to grow. Those closest to Shanann noticed subtle changes. She had recently returned from a work trip where she confided to a friend that she feared something was wrong in her marriage. She sensed distance in Chris, a growing secrecy, and a strange coldness she could not explain. Unbeknownst to her, Chris was living a double life. He had begun an affair with a co-worker and had already started envisioning a life without Shanann and their children. The story begins on the morning of August 13th, 2018, when Shanann and the children were expected at a friend's house and then at Bella's dance class. But by late morning, neither Shanann nor her daughters had shown up. Friends began calling her repeatedly, growing increasingly worried. Messages went unanswered. The sense of unease escalated when neighbors mentioned they had not seen the girls playing in the yard, a common sight just days before. Concern turned into alarm when the police were called to the Watts residence. When officers arrived at the home on Drake Street, the scene appeared almost ordinary. Shanann's car was in the garage, her purse still on the counter, and the children's toys neatly arranged as if they had simply stepped out. The officers knocked and entered, but no one answered. Chris Watts was present, visibly anxious, explaining to officers that he had no idea where his wife and daughters were. He claimed that he had gone to work that morning, returning only to find them gone, suggesting that Shanann may have left with the children after an argument. His demeanor was unusual. While most husbands in such situations display panic, desperation, or visible emotion, Chris appeared unusually composed, too composed, as if rehearsing a story. As investigators began their initial questioning, they took note of Chris's inconsistencies. He gave varying accounts of Shanann's last movements, the timing of her return from the trip, and where the children might have gone. At first glance, it seemed plausible. A wife leaving temporarily, children accompanying her. But subtle details did not add up. Security cameras from a neighbor's home captured Chris's truck backing into the driveway early that morning, with large objects loaded into it, yet no sign of Shanann or the girls. Something about the footage, combined with Chris's demeanor, began to unravel the story he was telling. As the day progressed, Chris made public appeals through local news channels. He begged for the return of his wife and daughters, speaking directly to the camera. But his words and actions sent a conflicting message. He referred to the girls in the past tense on multiple occasions and avoided eye contact. The community watched, hearts aching for the family, but a subtle unease lingered. Was Chris being truthful? His friends and neighbors started questioning whether the husband they thought they knew was hiding something far darker than anyone could imagine. Meanwhile, investigators followed leads and pieced together information from neighbors, friends, and security footage. Each revelation added pressure on Chris, who continued to weave a story that was becoming increasingly inconsistent. By evening, detectives requested that he submit to a polygraph test, a tool designed to assess truthfulness through physiological responses. Sitting in a small, sterile room, wired to sensors, Chris agreed, confident he could maintain his facade. But the results revealed a pattern of deception, leaving investigators certain that he was hiding critical information. At that point, Chris began to crack. The initial confession was incomplete, a partial truth he likely hoped would minimize his culpability. He admitted that Shanann was dead, but initially claimed that she had harmed their children, portraying himself as a victim forced to act in self-defense. His story was convoluted and lacked credibility. Detectives, seasoned in discerning truth from lies, pressed further, knowing from experience that the horrifying reality lay hidden beneath the surface. By nightfall, the grim truth started to emerge. The officers, following evidence and his increasingly fragmented narrative, were beginning to uncover a reality that no one had expected. The man who seemed ordinary, the husband and father who smiled in family photos, had orchestrated a crime of unimaginable cruelty. As the evening of August 13th faded into night, the calm suburban streets of Frederick hid a darkness that no neighbor could have imagined. Chris Watts, the husband and father who had appeared so ordinary in the daylight, was beginning to reveal the truth, but not in the way anyone could have hoped. Behind the closed doors of the Watts home, a meticulously planned and chilling crime had been executed. Chris had strangled Shanann in their master bedroom, a quiet, unassuming room in the Watts household. The act was not one of impulsive rage, but a cold, calculated decision, born from months of deception and the desire to erase the family from his life. Shanann, unaware of the danger lurking in the very home she cherished, had been taken completely by surprise. Within moments, the woman who had shared every joyful moment of her children's lives was silenced forever. With Shanann's body hidden, Chris turned his attention to the children, Bella, only 4, and Celeste, a toddler of 3. They had spent the day playing, laughing, unaware of the peril that had descended upon their family. Chris, without hesitation, loaded their tiny bodies into his truck and drove to an oil work site where he had previously been employed. The site was secluded, surrounded by large tanks used for storing crude oil, an industrial labyrinth that promised privacy for the crime he intended to commit. One by one, he smothered Bella and Celeste, small hands that had once clutched his own, now lifeless in a world that had offered them only love moments before. Their deaths were methodical, executed with a terrifying precision that left no room for mistake. Afterward, their bodies were deposited in oil tanks hidden from the world, a grim attempt to erase evidence of their existence. Meanwhile, back at the Watts residence, neighbors grew restless. Social media posts flooded in. Friends called repeatedly, and the absence of Shanann and the children became impossible to ignore. The community began to rally, sharing pleas for information and demanding answers. Local law enforcement, now alerted to the possibility of foul play, mobilized quickly. Detectives visited the home multiple times, piecing together details, questioning neighbors, and reviewing footage from security cameras. The more investigators dug, the more discrepancies they found in Chris's statements. He initially maintained a calm, measured tone, insisting he had no idea what had happened. But under scrutiny, his composure began to crack. Detectives noted his body language, the evasive answers, and the contradictions in his story. Each small lie, each hesitation drew suspicion, like a thread, unraveling from a tightly knit sweater. Chris eventually admitted partial truths. He spoke vaguely about Shanann's death, attempting to cast blame in improbable ways, suggesting scenarios where she was responsible for harming their daughters. Yet, every detail he provided only heightened the investigators' doubts. Detectives could sense the darkness beneath his words, the unspeakable actions he was trying to conceal. The public watched with horror as news anchors reported on the unfolding investigation. The contrast between Chris's calm public appeals and the grim reality investigators were uncovering created an eerie tension that gripped the nation. Social media erupted with speculation, with viewers dissecting every interview, every glance, every word, searching for a clue to the truth. By the following day, Chris's elaborate story began to unravel completely. Under persistent questioning, he finally confessed in full detail. He described the methodical killings, the sequence of events, and the disposal of the bodies. Shanann had been killed first, then the daughters. The gruesome act at the oil site, the burial of Shanann in a shallow grave nearby, painted a portrait of a man who had carefully orchestrated the annihilation of his own family. Investigators, horrified yet composed, documented every detail. They collected evidence from the oil site, examined the truck, and began the painstaking process of reconstructing the timeline of events. Forensic specialists analyzed the crime scene, confirming the method and sequence of deaths. Each piece of evidence corroborated Chris's confession, leaving no room for doubt. The town of Frederick was left reeling. Neighbors, friends, and family struggled to comprehend how a man they had known, someone who smiled in public and appeared devoted to his family, could commit such an unspeakable crime. The media coverage intensified, each revelation more shocking than the last. Interviews with friends and colleagues revealed the hidden cracks in Chris and Shanann's marriage, the growing secrecy, and the chilling signs that had been ignored or misinterpreted. Throughout it all, the images of Shanann and her daughters circulated widely. Bella's bright smile, Celeste's playful antics, Shanann's radiant energy, all juxtaposed against the brutality of their deaths. The world struggled to reconcile the innocence of the victims with the calculated evil of the perpetrator. As part 2 of the story closes, the full horror of the Watts murders had come to light. Chris Watts, the man who once appeared as an ordinary husband and father, had revealed himself to be a cold-blooded killer, responsible for ending the lives of the very people he was supposed to protect. The investigation had only begun, but the weight of the crime, the methodical nature of the killings, and the shock to the community had already secured this case as one of the most notorious family murders in modern American history. By the time the investigation had concluded, the scale of Chris Watts's crime had shocked the nation. Every detail that emerged painted a picture of a man who had meticulously planned and executed the unthinkable, the murder of his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters. The once ordinary suburban streets of Frederick, Colorado, would never feel safe again, haunted by the memory of that summer day when innocence was extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable. Chris Watts was arrested and formally charged with first-degree murder for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. As he sat in a small interrogation room, handcuffed and expressionless, the full weight of his actions seemed to settle over him, yet there was no visible remorse, no tear, no flicker of humanity in his eyes. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Security footage, witness statements, forensic findings, all meticulously confirming the story he had confessed to. It was a case where the truth, horrifying as it was, could not be denied. The media descended on Frederick with cameras, reporters, and helicopters hovering over the quiet neighborhood. The nation watched with a mix of fascination and horror as news outlets broadcast the details, each revelation more shocking than the last. Interviews with friends, co-workers, and family painted a portrait of a man who outwardly seemed normal, even devoted, yet secretly harbored a darkness that no one had anticipated. The world struggled to reconcile the smiling photos of the Watts family with the gruesome reality of their deaths. Chris Watts, facing the possibility of the death penalty, ultimately struck a plea deal. On November 2018, in a courtroom packed with press and family members, he pleaded guilty to all charges, sparing himself the formal trial and a potential death sentence. In his confession, he admitted, without embellishment, the cold and deliberate nature of the killings. He described the moments leading up to Shannan's murder, the suffocating of Bella and Celeste, and the disposal of the bodies in the oil tanks, all with a detached calm that sent shivers down the spines of those present. The sentencing was swift. Chris Watts was handed 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for Shannan, one for each daughter, and additional terms for unlawful termination of a pregnancy. The judge, visibly shaken by the details of the crimes, described them as heinous, calculated, and incomprehensible, and emphasized the profound impact on the community and the world at large. Psychologists later examined Chris Watts's behavior, seeking to understand how a man could commit such atrocities against those he was supposed to love and protect. Analysts pointed to a combination of narcissism, obsession with a new romantic interest, and an inability to confront personal responsibility. His actions were methodical, deliberate, and devoid of empathy. A chilling example of how calculated domestic murder can emerge from ordinary-looking lives. The media coverage continued for months, dissecting every angle, every interview, and every social media post. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials explored the case, delving into the psychology of family annihilators and the warning signs often overlooked by friends and neighbors. Viewers around the world were captivated, horrified, and saddened, reflecting on the fragility of trust, the invisibility of domestic deception, and the devastating consequences of betrayal. For the community of Frederick, the scars remained. Friends and neighbors who once waved at the Watts family now walked past the house with an uneasy awareness of the evil that had unfolded within its walls. Memorials were held for Shannan, Bella, and Celeste, bringing together strangers and friends in mourning and remembrance. Candles flickered, flowers were laid, and messages of love and grief adorned the streets where laughter once echoed. The Chris Watts case became one of the most infamous family murders in American history, not merely because of the brutality, but because it shattered the illusion of suburban perfection. It reminded the world that darkness can lurk behind ordinary smiles, that even the most seemingly devoted fathers and husbands can harbor dangerous secrets, and that the bonds of family, so often thought unbreakable, can be obliterated in an instant by selfish, calculated malice. As the courtroom emptied and Chris Watts began serving his life sentences, the story of Shannan, Bella, Celeste, and unborn Nico endured, a chilling testament to love lost, lives stolen, and the incomprehensible depth of human cruelty. The Watts murders remain a haunting, unforgettable case, compelling the world to question what lies beneath the surface of ordinary lives, and to remember that even in a seemingly safe home, horror can strike without warning.